Hi, and welcome to the fourth video in the housing module. This video will focus on tenant rights and some of the things to keep in mind if you have a client in rental housing. In this video, we'll cover some general information on rental housing, including things to keep in mind if a client is renting new housing or paying rent. Then we'll talk about some common issues that might come up between your client and their landlord, including landlords cutting off services or entering your client's unit. And finally, we'll take a look at discrimination and what you can do to help a client facing discrimination from a landlord. Let's start by taking a look at some of the things to keep in mind if your client is looking for housing. The first thing to keep in mind is that your client's landlord might ask them to sign a tenancy agreement. A tenancy agreement is also sometimes called a lease or a rental agreement, but it's a legal contract between a tenant and a landlord. These are usually in writing, but they can include verbal agreements. Ontario also has a standard lease form, and your client has the right to an agreement on this form. If your client is planning on signing a tenancy agreement, that agreement should detail some basic information. It should say how much rent will be and when that rent will be due. It should also set out how long the lease is for and what's included in the rent payment. It might also have additional terms that either your client or their landlord want to include. If your client has received this kind of agreement from a landlord, it's important that they read through it carefully so that they understand what they're signing. If the agreement is not on Ontario's standard lease form, you should remind them that they have a right to use this form and that they can ask their landlord for it. You can also help your client read through the agreement and highlight any additional terms that their landlord might have included to make sure they're aware of them. If your client is worried about any of the terms, you can also refer them for legal advice so that they can review the agreement with a legal service provider before they sign it. Another common experience your client might have while living in rental housing is their rent going up. The general rule is that landlords have to wait 1 year in between rent increases and have to give 90 days written notice before they can increase the rent. In most cases, your client's rent will only be able to go up by a certain percentage. This is called the guideline amount, and it's set by the government. If your client's unit is covered by the guideline, their landlord won't be able to legally increase the rent beyond the government's set percentage. If their landlord does want to go beyond the guideline, they'll have to apply to the Landlord and Tenant Board to do it, and your client should have the opportunity to oppose the increase and not pay the additional amounts. But not all rental units are covered by the guideline, and some people might be exempt from its protection. Some examples of units not covered by the guideline include those living in social housing or rent-geared-to-income housing, those living in shared spaces with the landlord or the landlord's family, and some newer buildings or mobile home parks. If your client is living in social housing or rent-geared-to-income housing, there will be different protections in place for them. Rent-geared-to-income housing has its own rules about how much rent can be and how much notice is required before the rent can go up, but it's usually based on family size and household income. If your client's worried that their landlord is increasing their rent illegally, you can let them know that they might be able to oppose this, and you should refer them for legal advice to see what their options are. The next thing we're going to cover are common issues that can come up with a landlord. Let's start by taking a look at a landlord cutting off or interfering with services in your client's unit. Even if your client hasn't paid their rent, it is illegal for a landlord to suspend, cut off, or otherwise interfere with any vital services. This includes things like water, hydro, gas, heat, meal services, or care services. If your client's landlord is suspending or interfering with any of these things, this could constitute harassment, and you can help your client by referring them to Ontario's Rental Housing Enforcement Unit. If they continue to experience issues with their landlord, they might be able to get help from the Landlord and Tenant Board, but you should refer your client for legal advice if they want to do that. Another common issue that might come up is a landlord entering your client's home. A landlord can only come into someone's house in specific situations, but is otherwise not allowed to enter whenever they want without a valid reason. Your client has a right to privacy in their home, and this means a landlord can't just come in whenever they want. For example, landlords can't come in to see how many guests your client has over, or come inside to search the unit for drugs or other substances. If a landlord does want to come inside, they'll typically have to give your client notice, usually 24 hours ahead of time, except in certain situations like an emergency or if they're showing the unit to someone else, like a buyer or another renter. If a landlord does want to come inside and is giving your client 24 hours notice, they can enter to do things like repairs or property inspections, but these need to be done at reasonable times. If your client's landlord has been entering their unit without notice and your client doesn't believe they have a valid reason, you should refer them to Ontario's Rental Housing Enforcement Unit. If they continue to experience issues with their landlord, they might be able to get help from the Landlord and Tenant Board, but you should refer them for legal advice if they want to do that. Another common issue that might come up is your client having bedbugs or other pests in their unit. It's a landlord's responsibility to not only get rid of any pests found in the unit, but also to stop any pests from getting in the first place. If this happens to your client, you can let them know that it isn't their responsibility to solve the problem, and that they should let their landlord know as soon as possible. Your client will have a responsibility to work with their landlord to fix the problem, though. This can mean letting the landlord into their home or temporarily moving furniture out of certain areas before the unit is cleaned. It's also important your client tell their landlord about any health concerns related to pest control ahead of time. For example, if their landlord plans to use an aerosol cleaning method and your client has respiratory problems, it's important that they let their landlord know before anything is done. If their landlord still doesn't resolve the problem, you should refer your client for legal advice because there are different options that might be available to them, depending on what type of unit they live in. The last thing we're going to take a look at is discrimination when it comes to rental housing. One of the ways you can help a client who's looking to rent a housing unit is by keeping in mind the list of things that a landlord can ask them before they choose to rent to them. Sometimes a landlord will ask someone to fill out a rental application or give more information to them before they'll rent out their unit. But there are restrictions on what landlords can ask. A landlord can ask your client things like what their income is, where they work, how many tenants will be staying in the unit, and what the names of the tenants are. They can also ask for references, for a credit check, for a police record check, or they can ask if your client smokes or if they have any pets. As we saw in the last video, landlords who request a criminal record check or ask about someone's criminal history might discriminate against them because of it. And unfortunately, there aren't any protections currently in place if that happens to your client. But there are protections in place to stop a landlord from asking your client about certain things. This includes if they're receiving income support from programs like Ontario Works or ODSP, if they have a disability, if they have kids or a spouse, or if they plan on having kids, if they're a Canadian citizen, or how old they are. They also can't ask about your client's religious, ethnic, or racial background, and they can't ask about your client's sexual orientation either. A landlord also can't discriminate against someone, whether they're a potential renter or their actual tenant, because of these things. Whether your client is applying for housing or already living in a unit, if they think that they're being discriminated against by a landlord, they might be able to get help from the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. The Human Rights Tribunal deals with claims of discrimination and harassment that fall under Ontario's Human Rights Code. But the Landlord and Tenant Board will also use this code. And in some cases, your client might even be able to choose between going to the Human Rights Tribunal or the Landlord and Tenant Board. So if your client is looking for more information on their options, you should refer them for legal advice, either from a legal clinic, a specialty legal clinic, or the Human Rights Legal Support Center, which is a province-wide legal service for people dealing with discrimination issues. And just like that, we've covered tenant rights. Until next time.